Sometimes the most precious gifts come to us when we least expect them. Sometimes a single moment of kindness can heal wounds we never knew were bleeding. On a quiet summer evening in Lancaster County, 68-year-old Jacob Stoltzfus was working his wheat field when a young girl appeared. She couldn't have been more than 10, her clothes dusty and worn. "Can I work on your farm, sir?" she asked simply. Jacob had lived alone for 20 years. He had no children, no family left. But something about this child touched his heart. He said yes, not knowing this moment would change everything. The girl worked hard and asked thoughtful questions. She brought laughter back to his quiet farm. But Jacob began to wonder, where did she come from? Why his farm? As weeks passed, small clues emerged that made him realize this wasn't a chance meeting. Who was this mysterious girl, and what connection? Did she have to Jacob's past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after the girl's arrival, Jacob Stoltzfus rose before dawn as he had for 68 years. The familiar creak of his bedroom floorboards, the soft shuffle of his work boots, the gentle hiss of the kerosene lamp coming to life. These sounds had marked the beginning of his days for longer than he cared to count, but this morning felt different. There was another presence in his house, a small figure curled beneath one of Sarah's quilts on the living room couch. He paused at the top of the stairs, listening. The child's breathing was steady and peaceful, so unlike the restless nights he remembered from his own childhood when storms or worries kept sleep at bay. She had accepted his simple offer of shelter with the quiet dignity of someone much older, asking only for a place to wash her face and hands before settling down for the night. Jacob descended the stairs carefully, avoiding the third step that always groaned under weight. In the kitchen, he lit the wood stove and began his morning ritual. The coffee percolated slowly while he stepped outside to check on his animals. The barn was a cathedral of warm shadows and sweet hay smells, filled with the gentle lowing of his 3 milk cows and the soft nickering of his draft horses. These creatures had been his companions through 2 decades of solitude, their needs providing structure to days that might otherwise stretch endlessly. When he returned to the house, the girl was awake, sitting upright on the couch with her small hands folded in her lap. Her auburn hair caught the early sunlight streaming through the windows, and her eyes, a striking shade of green, watched him with calm intelligence. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice carrying the same respectful formality as the evening before. "Good morning, child. Did you sleep well?" She nodded. "Yes, sir, thank you for your kindness." She stood and began folding the quilt with practiced precision, her movements efficient and purposeful. "May I help with the morning chores?" Jacob studied her face. There was something familiar in the set of her jaw, the way she held herself. But the feeling was fleeting, like trying to grasp smoke. "What's your name, child?" "Emma," she replied without hesitation. But when he waited for a surname, she simply repeated, "Emma." "Well, Emma, if you're going to work on this farm, you'll need a proper breakfast first." He moved toward the kitchen. "Can you cook?" "Yes, sir. I can make pancakes, eggs, biscuits, whatever you have." Her confidence surprised him. Most children her age would be homesick, crying for their mothers, overwhelmed by unfamiliar surroundings. Emma seemed remarkably self-possessed, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. As she worked beside him in the kitchen, Jacob noticed how naturally she moved through the space. She found the mixing bowls without asking, located the flour and eggs by intuition, and began preparing pancake batter with the ease of long practice. Her hands, though small, worked with the competence of someone who had been cooking for years. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked. Watching her flip pancakes with expert timing. "My father taught me," she said simply. "He said a person should know how to take care of themselves." "And where is your father now?" The pancake turner paused in her hand for just a moment. "He's gone, sir. Has been for some time." Jacob recognized the careful phrasing of someone protecting. themselves from painful memories. He had used similar words when speaking of Sarah in the early years after her death. He decided not to press for details. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, the morning light growing stronger through the windows. Emma cleaned her plate thoroughly, waste being foreign to both their upbringings, and helped clear the table, without being asked. "Now then," Jacob said, settling back in his chair with his coffee, "if you're going to stay, even temporarily, we should establish some understanding. This is a working farm, and everyone contributes according to their abilities. Can you accept that?" "Yes, sir. I wouldn't expect otherwise. The work starts early and ends late. Some days are harder than others." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Jacob believed her. Everything about Emma's demeanor suggested someone who had already faced challenges that would overwhelm many adults. "What about school? Surely someone your age should be learning reading and writing." "I can read and write just fine," Emma said, a hint of pride creeping into her voice. "I can do arithmetic too, and I know some geography and history." "Who taught you?" "My father, mostly, and I read whatever books I could find." She hesitated. "I'd like to keep learning if that's possible while I'm here." Jacob nodded slowly. The girl's manner of speaking, her vocabulary, her obvious intelligence, none of it fit with his assumption that she was a simple runaway. There were layers to Emma's story, depths he was only beginning to glimpse. From his kitchen window, Jacob could see his nearest neighbor's farm, the Yoder place, about a quarter-mile away. Samuel Yoder was a good man, though prone to gossip, and Jacob knew word of Emma's presence would spread through the community by sunset. The Amish valued their privacy and were naturally suspicious of outsiders, especially children who appeared without explanation or family connections. But for now, in the quiet of his kitchen with morning light streaming across the worn pine table, Jacob felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with family. Even if Emma wasn't truly family, even if her stay was temporary, she had brought something precious back into his home. The sound of another voice, the energy of youth, the basic human connection he had almost forgotten he needed. After breakfast, Emma insisted on washing the dishes, while Jacob retrieved his worn leather Bible from the living room. The book had belonged to his father before him, and his father's father before that. Its pages were soft with age, filled with pressed flowers. Sarah had gathered during their courting days. Roses, violets, baby's breath, each bloom marking a moment of happiness in their brief time together. He found Emma studying the kitchen with intelligent eyes, taking in details most visitors would never notice. She paused at the windowsill where Sarah's ceramic pitcher still sat, filled now with wild daisies Jacob had picked the day before, in a moment of unexpected sentimentality. "Your wife had good taste," Emma said quietly. Jacob looked up sharply. "How did you know I had a wife?" Emma gestured toward the pitcher, the delicate curtains, the arrangement of furniture. This house was decorated by a woman who loved beautiful things, but everything feels settled, like it hasn't been changed in a long time. Either your wife is very set in her ways, or—" She let the sentence trail off tactfully. "She passed away 20 years ago," Jacob said. "Her name was Sarah." "I'm sorry for your loss," Emma said with genuine sympathy. "She must have been a special lady to make such a warm home." The kindness in her voice caught Jacob off guard. Children her age typically didn't understand loss on such a deep level, yet Emma spoke with the wisdom of someone who had experienced her own grief. "She was," he managed. "We were married only 5 years, but they were good years." Emma nodded solemnly. "Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it has to be." Jacob stared at this remarkable child, wondering again where she had come from and what experiences had shaped such mature perspectives. But before he could ask more questions, the sound of approaching horses interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, he saw a familiar buggy turning into his drive. Samuel Yoder and his wife Rebecca were paying an early visit, no doubt curious about the smoke they would have seen from Jacob's chimney at an unusual hour. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's routines, any deviation attracted attention. "We have visitors," Jacob said. "The Yoders from the neighboring farm, good people but naturally curious." Emma straightened, her expression becoming carefully neutral. Should I hide? The question revealed more than Jacob was comfortable confronting. Why would a child's first instinct be to hide from neighbors? What was Emma running from or protecting herself against? "No hiding," he said firmly. "If you're staying on this farm, you'll meet the community eventually. Might as well start now." But as Samuel and Rebecca Yoder climbed down from their buggy, Jacob realized that Emma's arrival had just become much more complicated. In a close-knit community where everyone's business was everyone's concern, keeping secrets was nearly impossible. And Jacob had the growing suspicion that Emma carried secrets that could change everything. 2 weeks had passed since Emma's arrival, and she had settled into the rhythm of farm life with remarkable ease. Each morning, she rose before Jacob, helping, with chores that seemed to come naturally to her hands. She milked cows with the steady patience of someone who had done it countless times, gathered eggs without disturbing the hens, and worked in Sarah's old vegetable garden with an intuitive understanding of what each plant needed. The community had accepted her presence with the quiet grace typical of their faith. Emma's respectful manner and obvious knowledge of their customs had smoothed what could have been a difficult transition. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent during their meals, understood the importance of modest dress, and could recite Bible verses with the fluency of a child raised in the faith. But Jacob's peace was about to be shattered. On a humid Tuesday morning, as Emma worked beside him harvesting tomatoes, a dark sedan pulled into his driveway. Jacob straightened slowly, his weathered hands still gripping a vine heavy with ripe fruit. Vehicles like this rarely visited Amish farms, unless they brought trouble. 2 people emerged from the car, a middle-aged woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase, and a uniformed police officer. The woman's expression was professional but determined, the kind Jacob had learned to distrust during his rare encounters with government officials. "Mr. Stoltzfus," the woman called, approaching with measured steps. "I'm Linda Morrison from Children's Services. This is Officer Davis. We'd like to speak with you about a missing child." Emma's hands stilled on the tomato plant. Without a word, she began moving slowly toward the barn, keeping the vegetable rows between herself and the visitors. Jacob felt his heart begin to pound, but kept his expression neutral. "Good morning," he replied calmly. "How can I help you?" Linda Morrison opened her briefcase and withdrew a photograph. "We're looking for this girl. 10 years old, brown hair, green eyes. She ran away from her foster placement in Philadelphia 2 weeks ago. We have reports that someone matching her description was seen in this area." Jacob accepted the photograph with steady hands, though his chest felt tight. The image showed Emma's face clearly, captured in what looked like a school picture. Her expression was more guarded than the child he had come to know, but it was unmistakably her. "She's considered at risk," Officer Davis added. The foster family reported that she had been having behavioral difficulties, refusing to follow rules, being disruptive. When she disappeared, she took some cash and clothing. Jacob studied the photograph longer than necessary, buying time to think. Through his peripheral vision, he could see Emma had reached the barn and slipped inside. "This is troubling news," he said carefully. "A child that young, alone and far from home." "Indeed," Linda Morrison agreed, "which is why we're checking all the local farms. Children sometimes seek out rural areas when they run away, thinking they can hide more easily. Have you seen anyone matching this description?" The lie formed on Jacob's lips before he could examine his conscience. "No, I haven't seen this child." The words felt heavy, foreign to a man who had built his life on honesty and plain speaking. Linda Morrison's gaze sharpened. "Are you certain? We have several reports of a young girl asking for work at farms throughout the county. Your community is known for its kindness to those in need. We help when we can, Jacob acknowledged, but I would remember a child this young seeking work. Most runaways don't make it this far from Philadelphia on foot. Officer Davis stepped closer. Mr. Stoltzfus, I need to ask directly, do you have any children living on your property? Any recent visitors or temporary residents? Jacob met the officer's eyes steadily. I live alone, Officer Davis. Have for 20 years since my wife passed. My neighbors can confirm this. Would you mind if we looked around? Linda Morrison asked. Just to be thorough. Jacob's mind raced. Emma was hidden in the barn, but a thorough search would certainly uncover her presence. I'm afraid I can't permit that without proper legal documentation, he said. Our community values privacy, and we've had difficulties with government overreach in the past. Officer Davis's expression hardened slightly. We're trying to find a missing child, sir, a little girl who could be in danger, and I appreciate your dedication, Jacob replied. But if this child was on my property, which she is not, wouldn't the Christian thing be to treat her with kindness rather than force? Linda Morrison made notes in a small pad. Mr. Stoltzfus, I want to be clear about the legal implications here. Harboring a runaway minor is a serious offense. If you have information about this child's whereabouts and fail to report it, you could face criminal charges. Jacob felt the weight of her words, but also the stronger pull of his protective instincts. In 2 weeks, Emma had become precious to him in ways he hadn't thought possible. The idea of her being forced back to a situation where she felt compelled to run away made his chest tighten with anger. I understand the law, he said quietly. I also understand that sometimes the law and what's right don't align perfectly. After the officials left with promises to return, Jacob waited a full hour before calling Emma from the barn. She emerged slowly, her face pale but composed. They showed me your photograph, he said gently. Emma nodded, unsurprised. I knew they would come eventually. I was hoping for more time. Emma, Jacob said, settling onto his porch steps and patting the space beside him. I think it's time for the whole truth. She sat beside him, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. My real name is Emma, like I told you, but I haven't been completely honest about everything else. From the pocket of her dress, she withdrew a folded photograph, its edges worn soft from handling. The image showed a young woman in simple dress, her hair pinned back in the Amish style. She was standing beside a wooden fence, smiling at the camera with gentle eyes. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The woman bore a striking resemblance to his late wife Sarah, but there was something else, something that made his hands tremble as he studied the photograph. This is my mother, Emma said softly. Her name was Mary. Jacob's mind reeled. The bone structure, the shape of the eyes, the way she held her head, it was eerily familiar, but it was impossible. Sarah had been his only connection to family, and she had died childless. Where did you get this photograph? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. My father kept it always, Emma replied. He said she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever known, and that losing her broke his heart. He talked about her family, about the community she came from. He described this place, these farms, the way people lived here. Emma, Jacob said carefully, what was your father's name? She looked up at him with those remarkable green eyes, and in that moment Jacob saw something that made his heart stop. The shape of her face, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her hair caught the light, features he recognized from his own childhood, from looking in mirrors and old family photographs. His name was Samuel, Emma said. Samuel Stoltzfus. He said he had a brother named Jacob who lived on a farm in Lancaster County. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should find you. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Jacob gripped the porch railing, his knuckles white with the strain. Samuel, his younger brother Samuel, who had left the community 30 years ago after falling in love with an English woman. Samuel, who had been shunned by their family and the church. Samuel, who had written letters that Jacob had eventually stopped answering, unable to bear the pain of his brother's choices. He's gone now, Emma continued, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes, has been for 5 years. Car accident. I went into foster care after that, but it was... She paused, searching for words. It wasn't good. They didn't understand me, didn't care about me. I was just another placement, another problem to manage. Jacob stared at this remarkable child, his brother's child, his niece, and felt the full weight of 30 years of regret crash down upon him. While he had been nursing his wounded pride and adhering to the rules of shunning, Samuel had been raising a daughter. While Jacob had been alone in his righteous isolation, Samuel had been building a family, creating love, passing down stories about the brother who had turned his back on him. "I'm sorry," Jacob whispered, the words inadequate for the magnitude of his failure. "Emma, I'm so deeply sorry." She reached over and took his weathered hand in her small one. "He never blamed you, Grandpa Jacob. He said the rules were hard, but that you were a good man who followed what you believed was right. He said if I ever found you, you would understand about family being more important than rules." Grandpa Jacob. The title hit him like a physical blow, filling an emptiness he hadn't even realized existed. He looked down at Emma, his brothers, and daughter, his own flesh and blood, and understood that his quiet life had just been turned completely upside down. But as the social worker had made clear, hiding Emma was now a criminal act. The authorities would return, probably with warrants and more intensive search methods. If he was caught harboring her, he could face jail time, lose his farm, destroy the quiet life he had built. Yet as he looked into Emma's eyes, Samuel's eyes, his family's eyes, Jacob realized the choice had already been made. Some things were more important than safety, more valuable than laws, more precious than a peaceful existence. "Well then, granddaughter," he said, his voice stronger than he felt, "I suppose we need to figure out how to keep you home." The revelation of Emma's true identity changed everything and nothing at the same time. She was still the same hard-working, thoughtful child who had appeared in his wheat field 3 weeks ago. But now Jacob understood the familiarity he had sensed from their first meeting. The stubborn tilt of her chin was pure Stoltzfus. The way she hummed while working echoed his own childhood habits, and her natural affinity for farm life came from generations of agricultural knowledge flowing through her veins. In the days following the social services visit, Jacob found himself studying Emma with new eyes, searching for traces of his brother in her expressions and mannerisms. Samuel had been 8 years younger, born when Jacob was already helping with the farm's heavier work. Their father had died when Samuel was only 12, leaving Jacob to serve as both brother and father figure, a responsibility he had taken seriously until Samuel's rebellion against their community's ways. "Tell me about your father," Jacob said. One morning as they worked side by side in the barn, repairing harnesses that had grown brittle with age, Emma's hands stilled on the leather strap she had been conditioning with neat's foot oil. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," Jacob admitted. "I realize I threw away 30 years of his life because I was too proud to understand his choices." Emma considered this carefully, the way she seemed to approach all serious topics. "He was gentle," she said finally. "Strong, but gentle. He could fix anything, cars, furniture, broken toys. He said working with his hands was in his blood, that his father and grandfather had been craftsmen too." Jacob nodded, remembering how Samuel had always possessed an intuitive understanding of wood and metal, able to see solutions that escaped others. Their father had been the same way, able to coax beauty from raw materials, with nothing but simple tools and infinite patience. "He taught you woodworking?" Jacob asked. "Some," Emma replied. "Mostly whittling and simple repairs." He said girls needed to understand how things worked just as much as boys. She looked up at Jacob with a slight smile. He was ahead of his time in some ways. That evening, Jacob climbed to his attic for the first time in years, searching through boxes of memories he had tried to forget. Dust motes danced in the light of his kerosene lamp as he moved past Sarah's carefully preserved belongings, past his parents' few remaining possessions, to a corner where a small wooden chest sat untouched. Inside the chest were remnants of Samuel's childhood, a slingshot carved from hickory, a collection of smooth river stones, drawings of horses and barns rendered with surprising skill for a young boy. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in faded cloth, Jacob found what he was looking for. The wooden horse was no larger than his palm, carved with exquisite detail from a piece of maple that had aged to a warm honey color. Samuel had made it during the winter he turned 15, spending countless hours by the fire with nothing but a pocket knife and boundless patience. The horse's mane flowed like water, its legs were positioned in perfect galloping motion, and its eyes seemed alive with spirit. Jacob had watched his brother create this masterpiece, marveling at the skill Samuel possessed at such a young age. But when Samuel had presented it as a gift for Jacob's 23rd birthday, pride and jealousy had made Jacob's response lukewarm. He had accepted the horse politely, but never displayed it prominently, never acknowledged the love and effort Samuel had poured into its creation. Now, holding this testament to his brother's talent and affection, Jacob felt the full weight of opportunities lost, words unspoken, bridges burned by his own rigid adherence to rules that seemed far less important than family. He found Emma in the kitchen the next morning, kneading bread with the same methodical rhythm Sarah had used. The sight of her small hands working the dough, her tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth in concentration, brought back memories of watching Sarah perform the same ritual years ago. "I have something for you," Jacob said, setting the wooden horse on the flour-dusted counter. Emma's eyes widened as she recognized the craftsmanship. She wiped her hands carefully on her apron before touching the carving with reverent fingers. "This is beautiful work," she whispered. "The detail is incredible." "Your father made it," Jacob said. "He was 15 at the time. I should have treasured it more than I did." Emma lifted the horse to eye level, studying every curve and line, with the appreciation of someone who understood the skill required. "He told me he used to carve," she said softly. "He said it was like finding the shape that was already hiding in the wood, that the carver's job was just to reveal what was meant to be." He said that, even as a boy, Jacob remembered, always philosophical about his work, always seeing deeper meaning in simple things. "May I keep this?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It belongs to you by right," Jacob replied. "Everything of his belongs to you." That afternoon brought visitors, Samuel and Rebecca Yoder, along with several other community members, who had heard whispered conversations about Jacob's unusual houseguest. The Amish grapevine was efficient and thorough, carrying news and concerns through the network of families with remarkable speed. Emma served coffee and fresh bread with the poise of someone twice her age, answering questions about her background with careful honesty. She explained that she was Jacob's niece, that her father had been raised Amish but left the community as a young man, and that she had sought out her grandfather after finding herself alone in the world. Bishop Miller, a stern man in his 70s, with penetrating blue eyes, studied Emma with particular intensity. "And you understand our ways, child?" he asked. "You know what it means to live as we do?" "Yes, sir," Emma replied respectfully. "My father taught me about the community he came from. He said it was a good life, built on faith and family and honest work. Yet he chose to leave," Rebecca Yoder observed, not unkindly but with genuine puzzlement. Emma's response revealed a wisdom that impressed even the skeptical bishop. "He fell in love," she said simply. "Sometimes the heart leads us in directions we don't expect, but he never stopped loving the family he came from or the values they taught him." The community members exchanged glances, recognizing truth when they heard it. Emma's respectful manner, her obvious knowledge of their customs, and her clear devotion to Jacob were winning them over despite their initial reservations. After the visitors left, Jacob found Emma in the attic, studying Samuel's drawings with intense concentration. She had arranged them carefully on an old table, creating a gallery of her father's childhood artwork. He was talented even then, she said without looking up. Look at this one. He must have been watching the horses in the pasture for hours to capture their movements so perfectly. Jacob joined her at the table, seeing his brother's work through Emma's appreciative eyes. He wanted to be an artist, Jacob said quietly. Father discouraged it, said it was impractical dreaming. I supported Father's position, but he became one anyway, Emma pointed out. Just in a different way. He fixed things, built things, created beauty wherever he went. She looked up at Jacob with those familiar green eyes. You can't kill talent, Grandpa Jacob. It just finds new ways to grow. Standing there in the dusty attic, surrounded by memories of the brother he had lost through his own stubbornness, Jacob realized that Emma hadn't just brought herself into his life. She had brought Samuel back as well, restoring connections that pride and time had seemed to sever forever. But even as he marveled at this second chance, Jacob knew their fragile peace couldn't last. The authorities would return, more determined and better prepared. The community's acceptance, while encouraging, wouldn't protect them from the law. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a troubling question persisted. Why had Emma's foster placement been so terrible that she felt compelled to run hundreds of miles to find a grandfather she had never met? The answers to these questions would come soon enough. For now, Jacob was content to stand beside his brother's daughter, surrounded by remnants of a childhood he had failed to properly treasure, and feel the healing presence of family he had thought lost forever. A month into Emma's stay, Jacob decided to share the most sacred space in his house, Sarah's kitchen. He had preserved everything exactly as she had left it the day she died, from the ceramic canisters lined up on the counter to the recipe box that held her handwritten cards, each one annotated with notes about adjustments and improvements she had discovered over their 5 years of marriage. This was Sarah's domain, Jacob explained, as he led Emma to the large pantry off the main kitchen. She took great pride in her cooking and baking, said feeding people was one of the purest forms of love. Emma ran her fingers over the wooden shelves, lined with empty mason jars, the spice rack Sarah had organized alphabetically, the small stool she had used to reach the highest shelves. You've kept everything just as it was, she observed softly. Jacob nodded, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied thoughts of his late wife. I couldn't bear to change anything. It felt like losing her twice. She must have been a wonderful cook, Emma said, examining the worn recipe box with its brass corners and faded floral design. The best in the community, Jacob confirmed. Her bread was legendary. People would time their visits to coincide with her baking days. He paused, remembering Sarah's laugh as neighbors found excuses to drop by when the scent of fresh loaves filled the air. Emma opened the recipe box carefully, treating it with the reverence due a sacred object. The cards inside were yellowed, with age, covered in Sarah's neat handwriting and occasional flower fingerprints that had become permanent parts of the collection. Look at this, Emma said, holding up a card titled Sunday Bread in Sarah's careful script. She's written notes all around the edges. Add extra salt on humid days. Let rise longer in winter. Papa prefers darker crust. Jacob smiled despite his melancholy. She was always experimenting, always trying to perfect her recipes. That bread card was her masterpiece. Took her 3 years to get it exactly right. Emma studied the recipe with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. The proportions are interesting, she murmured. Very similar to what my father taught me, but with some clever modifications. She looked up at Jacob with sudden excitement. Could we try making it? I'd love to learn her technique. The request caught Jacob off guard. For 20 years, no one had used Sarah's recipes, touched her measuring cups, or worked at her counter. The kitchen had become a museum, preserved but lifeless. The idea of Emma bringing it back to active use felt both thrilling and terrifying. I suppose, he said slowly, that Sarah would have wanted her recipes to be used rather than just preserved. They spent the afternoon working through Sarah's bread recipe, Emma following each instruction with careful precision, while Jacob provided commentary about his wife's methods. As Emma kneaded the dough, her technique remarkably similar to Sarah's despite never having seen it, Jacob found himself sharing memories he hadn't spoken aloud in decades. She used to sing while she baked, he said, watching Emma work the dough, with confident hands. Hymns mostly, but sometimes folk songs her mother had taught her, said music made everything rise better. Emma smiled and began humming softly, a melody Jacob recognized but couldn't quite place. Her voice was sweet and clear, filling the kitchen with warmth it hadn't known for 20 years. As the bread rose for its first proving, Emma continued exploring the recipe box. She found cards for apple butter, corn relish, pickled beets, and dozens of other preserved foods that had sustained Jacob and Sarah through long winters. But as she moved deeper into the collection, her fingers found something unexpected, an envelope wedged between the cards, its edges yellowed with age. "What's this?" she asked, holding up the envelope. Jacob frowned, not recognizing it. "I've never seen that before. Sarah must have tucked it away for safekeeping. The envelope was addressed in Sarah's handwriting, but had never been mailed. The intended recipient's name made Jacob's breath catch. Samuel Stoltzfus, General Delivery, Pittsburgh, PA. With trembling fingers, Jacob opened the envelope and withdrew 2 sheets of paper covered in Sarah's familiar script. The date at the top was from 15 years ago, 5 years after Samuel had left the community, 3 years before Sarah's death. "Dear Samuel," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well and happy in your new life. Jacob speaks of you often, though he pretends not to miss you terribly. I know he struggles with the church's teachings about shunning, but please don't think his silence means he doesn't love you." Emma watched Jacob's face as he read, seeing emotions play across his weathered features like clouds moving across a landscape. When he finished the first page, his hands shook as he turned to the second. "I have news that might bring you joy," the letter continued. "We have learned that we cannot have children of our own. The doctor was gentle but certain. My body simply cannot carry life. Jacob has accepted this with his usual quiet dignity, but I know it grieves him more than he admits. He would have been such a good father." Jacob's vision blurred as he read Sarah's words. She had never shared these deep feelings with him, had never spoken of her own grief about their childlessness. He had assumed her acceptance was complete, that she felt no regret about the family they would never have. "I find myself thinking about your future children, Samuel. They will be Jacob's nephews and nieces, the closest thing to grandchildren we will ever know. I hope someday the church's rules will matter less than family love. I hope your children will know they have an aunt and uncle in Lancaster County who would welcome them with open hearts." The letter went on to describe Sarah's hopes for reconciliation, her dreams of meeting Samuel's future wife and children, her belief that time would heal the wounds caused by his departure. But it had never been sent, hidden away in a recipe box, instead of traveling to Pittsburgh, where Samuel might have received the forgiveness and love he needed to hear. Emma remained silent as Jacob finished reading, respecting the profound emotions clearly overwhelming him. When he finally looked up, tears streaming down his cheeks, she reached over and gently took his hand. "She knew," Emma said softly. "She knew about me before I was even born. She was hoping for exactly what happened, that Samuel's children would find their way home." Jacob nodded, unable to speak. The letter revealed not only Sarah's wisdom and compassion, but also his own failure to bridge the gap with his brother while there was still time. If he had been less rigid, less concerned with community rules, and more focused on family love, Samuel might have known he was welcome. Emma might have grown up knowing her grandfather instead of spending 5 terrible years in foster care. But she never sent it, Jacob finally managed. Why would she write such a beautiful letter and never send it? Emma studied the envelope thoughtfully. Maybe she was waiting for the right time. Maybe she hoped Jacob, you, would decide to reach out first. Maybe she was planning to ask you about sending it but ran out of time. The bread timer chimed, calling them back to the present. As Emma removed the golden loaves from the oven, their kitchen filled with the same aroma that had marked countless happy days during Jacob's marriage. But now the scent carried additional meaning. It was the smell of family traditions being passed down, of connections being restored, of love finding new ways to express itself across generations. That evening, as they shared warm bread spread, with butter and honey, Jacob made a decision that had been forming in his heart since Emma's arrival. "Tomorrow," he said, "we're going to visit Bishop Miller. It's time to speak honestly about your situation and ask for the community's official protection." Emma's eyes widened. "Are you sure? Once we involve the church leadership, there's no going back to keeping secrets." Jacob looked at this remarkable child who had brought his brother back into his life, who had restored warmth to his lonely house, who had shown him that some rules mattered less than love. "Some things are worth taking risks for, granddaughter. Family is one of them." Jacob had kept Samuel's letters hidden in the false bottom of his desk drawer for 15 years, unable to read them but unwilling to destroy them. The morning after discovering Sarah's unsent letter, he retrieved the bundle of envelopes, their edges worn soft from years of careful handling. Emma sat beside him at the kitchen table as he untied the faded ribbon that held them together. "I stopped reading these after the 5th or 6th one," Jacob admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "They made me angry at first. Samuel writing about his new life, his happiness away from the community. Later, they just made me sad. The earliest letters were full of defiance and hurt. Samuel wrote about his job in a Pittsburgh furniture factory, his small apartment, his struggle to adapt to English ways. But as Jacob read aloud, the tone gradually shifted from anger to longing, from rebellion to a deep desire for reconciliation. "Listen to this one," Jacob said, unfolding a letter dated 12 years ago. "Dear Jacob, I know you may not want to hear from me, but I had to write. I met someone. Her name is Mary, and she's everything I never knew I was looking for. She's kind and strong and doesn't judge me for the choices I've made. I think you would like her, if you could meet her." Emma's breath caught. "He's writing about my mother." Jacob continued reading. "Mary understands about family, about the pain of separation. Her own parents died when she was young, so she knows what it means to be alone in the world. She says everyone deserves a second chance at belonging somewhere." The next several letters chronicled Samuel's courtship and marriage, his attempts to blend his Amish upbringing with his new life, his growing skill as a furniture maker. Each letter ended with the same plea, a request for reconciliation, an invitation for Jacob to meet Mary, a hope that family might prove stronger than doctrine. "Here's one from 10 years ago," Jacob said, his voice growing thick with emotion. "Mary is expecting our first child, a little one who will carry Stoltzfus blood, who will be your nephew or niece, whether the church recognizes it or not. I want this child to know about the good parts of where I came from, the values, the work ethic, the importance of faith and family." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "He wrote about me before I was born. And here," Jacob said, unfolding another letter from 9 years ago. "We have a daughter, Emma Rose Stoltzfus, born healthy and perfect. She has Mary's green eyes, but the Stoltzfus stubborn chin. I hold her tiny hand and think about Dad teaching us to milk cows, about you showing me how to plane wood smooth as silk. I want to pass those memories to Emma, but I can't teach what I'm not allowed to remember." The weight of lost years pressed down on Jacob like stones. While he had been maintaining his righteous separation, Samuel had been raising Emma with stories of the family he could never see. The child in his kitchen had grown up hearing about her grandfather Jacob, learning Stoltzfus traditions secondhand, dreaming of a place she might never be allowed to visit. The final letters, written in the last 2 years before Samuel's death, carried a different tone entirely. Samuel wrote about Mary's illness, her slow decline, despite his desperate attempts to find treatment. He described trying to work and care for his wife, while keeping 5-year-old Emma from understanding the full gravity of their situation. "Mary made me promise," Jacob read from the final letter, "that if anything happens to both of us, I would make sure Emma knows about her Amish family. She says a child needs roots, needs to understand where she comes from. I've told Emma stories about the farm, about the community, about her grandfather Jacob, who makes the best horseshoes in Lancaster County. If you're reading this, Jacob, it means I kept my promise to reach out one more time. The last envelope was different from the others, thicker, more formal. Inside, Jacob found Samuel's will, witnessed and notarized, naming Jacob as Emma's guardian in the event of Samuel's death. The document was 5 years old, created after Mary's death when Samuel was struggling to raise Emma alone. "He planned for this," Emma said quietly, studying the legal papers. "He wanted to make sure I would find you." Jacob stared at the will, understanding finally why Emma had seemed so confident about finding his farm, why she had known exactly what to say and how to act. Samuel had prepared her for this possibility, had given her detailed instructions about Lancaster County, about Amish customs, about the grandfather who might be her only family if everything else failed. "The foster system never contacted me," Jacob said, his voice hollow with the enormity of bureaucratic failure. "When you were placed in care, no one looked for family members. They never found this will, never tried to locate your grandfather." Emma nodded grimly. "The social worker said my father had no family, that he was completely alone in the world. They never investigated beyond what was immediately obvious." That afternoon, Jacob made a decision that would have shocked his younger self. He hitched up his buggy and drove to the home of David Byler, a member of their community who worked as a translator and liaison with English authorities when legal issues arose. David listened carefully as Jacob explained Emma's situation, occasionally asking questions about the timeline and documentation. His expression grew increasingly troubled as the full scope of the bureaucratic failure became clear. "This is serious, Jacob," David said finally. "The child was placed illegally. They had no right to put her in foster care when she had family willing and able to care for her. The will is clear and properly executed. You have strong legal grounds to challenge the placement. But first I need to get her official status resolved," Jacob replied. "She can't keep hiding from social workers. We need the law on our side, instead of working against us." David nodded thoughtfully. "I know a lawyer in Lancaster who understands our community, who has helped with similar situations. Elizabeth Hartman. She's not Amish, but she respects our ways and fights hard for her clients." That evening, as Emma helped Jacob prepare dinner, she seemed unusually quiet. Finally, as they sat down to eat, she voiced the fear that had been building in her heart. "Grandpa Jacob," she said carefully, "what if the legal system decides I'm better off in foster care? What if they think an old bachelor farmer can't properly raise a young girl?" Jacob reached across the table and took her. "And then we'll prove them wrong. We'll show them what family means, what love looks like when it's real and lasting. Your father fought for you in his own way. Now it's my turn." But even as he spoke these brave words, Jacob felt the cold touch of fear. The English legal system was complex and often arbitrary. Social workers had broad discretion about child placement, and they might view an elderly Amish man as an unsuitable guardian regardless of family connections. Still, as he looked at Emma's face, Samuel's eyes, in Sarah's gentle expression, Jacob knew he would fight with everything he had. Some battles were worth risking everything for, and family was the most important battle of all. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the farm where 3 generations of Stoltzfus men had worked the same fields, followed the same rhythms, built the same kind of quiet, purposeful life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal complications, and difficult decisions. But tonight, Jacob had his brother's daughter safely under his roof, and that was enough to sustain him through whatever storms lay ahead. The crumpled envelope bearing Samuel's last known address had been tucked between the final letters. Its Pittsburgh postmark faded, but still legible. Jacob smoothed it carefully on his kitchen table, studying the return address that represented his brother's final attempt to maintain connection with home. The apartment number was written in Samuel's careful handwriting: 412 Carson Street, Apartment 3B, Pittsburgh, PA. Elizabeth Hartman, the lawyer David Byler had recommended, proved to be a woman in her 50s, with steel-grey hair and compassionate eyes that missed nothing. She sat across from Jacob and Emma in her Lancaster office, reviewing the documentation they had brought. Samuel's letters, his will, Emma's birth certificate, and records from the foster care system that David had helped them obtain. "This is one of the most egregious cases of systemic failure I've seen," Elizabeth said, setting down the last document. "Emma should never have been placed in foster care. A simple search would have revealed Samuel's will and your contact information." Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "The social worker said my father had no family. She acted like I was making up stories about having a grandfather. Unfortunately, overworked caseworkers sometimes take shortcuts that have devastating consequences," Elizabeth replied gently. "But we have strong grounds for challenging the original placement and establishing your legal guardianship." Mr. Stoltzfus, Jacob, felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. "What does the process involve?" "First, we'll need to prove that you're a suitable guardian," Elizabeth explained. "That means home inspections, background checks, character references from your community. The court will want to ensure Emma's physical, emotional, and educational needs will be met." That afternoon, Jacob and Emma drove to Pittsburgh with David, Byler serving as their guide through the unfamiliar urban landscape. The journey took them far from the rolling farmland of Lancaster County into a world of concrete and steel that felt alien to both of them. Carson Street proved to be a narrow lane lined with aging row houses converted into apartments. Number 412 was a 3-story brick building with worn steps and windows that had seen better days. The current tenant of apartment 3B, a young woman named Lisa, was kind enough to let them inside when Jacob explained their mission. The previous tenant left. "Some things in the basement storage area," Lisa said, leading them down narrow stairs. "The landlord keeps meaning to clean it out, but you know how that goes." The storage unit was small and musty, filled with the accumulated debris of lives that had moved on. But in one corner, Jacob found a cardboard box labeled Samuel's Workshop, in his brother's familiar handwriting. Inside the box, Emma discovered treasures that connected her to the father she still missed desperately. There were hand tools worn smooth by years of use, sketches of furniture designs, and several small wooden figures Samuel had carved during quiet evenings. Each piece showed the same artistic sensibility Jacob remembered from their childhood, refined by years of professional craftsmanship. "Look at this," Emma whispered, lifting out a partially completed rocking horse. The piece was similar to the small horse Samuel had given Jacob years ago, but larger and more elaborate. "He was making this for me. I remember him working on it in the evenings before." Her voice broke as she traced the flowing mane with gentle fingers. Jacob found himself fighting back tears as he examined his brother's work. The skill was unmistakable. The love poured into every curve and detail, obvious to anyone who understood craftsmanship. Samuel had become the artist their father had discouraged him from being, but he had done it alone, without family to share his achievements or appreciate his talents. Among the tools, Emma found something that made her gasp: a small wooden box containing dozens of letters Samuel had written but never sent. Unlike the letters to Jacob, these were addressed to Emma herself, intended to be given to her when she was older. "My dearest Emma," Jacob read from the first letter, dated when Emma was 6 years old. "Today, you helped me sand a table for Mrs. Rodriguez next door. Your little hands worked so carefully, And you ask such thoughtful questions about why we smooth the wood before applying finish. I tried to explain that everything worth doing requires patience and attention, but I think you understood better than my words could convey. The letters chronicled Emma's childhood through Samuel's eyes, celebrating her curiosity, her kindness, her growing skills around his workshop. They revealed a father's deep love and his determination to raise his daughter with the values he had learned in Lancaster County, even though he could never return home himself. He wrote to me every few months, Emma said, studying the dates on the envelopes. All these years he was having conversations with me that I never knew about. The final letter, written just weeks before Samuel's accident, contained instructions Emma was only now old enough to understand. If something happens to me, Emma Rose, remember that you are a Stoltzfus. That name means something. It means integrity, hard work, and family bonds that can't be broken by distance or disagreement. Your grandfather Jacob may seem stern, but he has the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. If you find yourself alone, go to him. He will understand about family being more important than old wounds. The drive back to Lancaster County was quiet, both Jacob and Emma lost in thought as they processed the day's discoveries. The box of Samuel's belongings sat between them like a bridge connecting past and present, father and daughter, brother and brother. That evening, as Emma arranged her father's carved figures on her windowsill, she turned to Jacob with a question that had been building in her heart. Grandpa Jacob, do you think you would have forgiven him if he had lived? If he had come back to visit, would you have welcomed him home? Jacob considered the question carefully, understanding its importance to Emma's sense of belonging. I've spent 5 years thinking about that question, ever since I learned about his death. The honest answer is that I don't know what I would have done then. I was younger, more rigid in my thinking, more concerned with following rules than understanding their purpose. He moved to the window where Emma was working, looking out at the fields where he and Samuel had played as boys. But I know what I would do now. I would welcome him with open arms. I would tell him that I was wrong to let pride and doctrine separate us from love. I would ask his forgiveness for all the years we lost. Emma nodded solemnly. He never stopped loving you, you know. Even when he was angry, even when the letters stopped coming back, he never stopped hoping you would change your mind. And now I have his greatest gift, Jacob said, placing a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. I have you, carrying his love and his memory, giving me a chance to do better than I did the first time. The next morning brought news that would test Jacob's resolve. Elizabeth Hartman called to inform them that the Department of Children and Family Services had scheduled a formal hearing to determine Emma's custody. The foster care system was fighting back, arguing that Jacob's age and single status made him an unsuitable guardian, regardless of family connections. They're bringing in experts to testify about the importance of placing children in traditional family structures, Elizabeth warned. We'll need character witnesses, evidence of community support, and a compelling argument about why your guardianship serves Emma's best interests. Jacob hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the battle ahead. But as he watched Emma in the garden, teaching his chickens to eat from her hand with the same patience Samuel had once shown with animals, he knew this was a fight worth having. Some things were worth risking everything for. Family was at the top of that list. The morning Emma finally revealed her birth certificate was one of those perfect September days when the air carried hints of autumn and the wheat fields glowed golden in the early sunlight. She had been living with Jacob for 6 weeks, and their daily routine had settled into the comfortable rhythm of family life. But Jacob sensed something different in her manner as she helped with the morning milking, a tension, a weight of unspoken words that seemed to press against her small shoulders. After breakfast, as they sat at the kitchen table with coffee and fresh bread, Emma reached into the small cloth bag that contained her few possessions. With careful hands, she withdrew a folded document that had been worn soft at the edges from years of handling. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly. "Something I should have shown you from the beginning." Jacob accepted the document with growing apprehension. It was an official birth certificate, issued by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, bearing the state seal and formal signatures that made it legal and binding, but it was the name printed in careful type that made Jacob's world tilt sideways. Emma Rose Stoltzfus, born September 15th, 14 years ago. Father, Samuel David Stoltzfus. Mother, Mary Elizabeth Stoltzfus, née Patterson. Jacob stared at the paper, his mind struggling to process information that changed everything he thought he knew. "You're 14, he said slowly. "Not 10. Emma nodded, tears beginning to form in her green eyes. "I know I look young for my age. I always have. People treat me like a child, so I learned to act like one when it was useful." "But why?" Jacob began, then stopped as the full implications began to dawn on him. A 14-year-old who had been navigating the foster care system for 5 years. A teenager who had planned and executed a complex journey across state lines. A young woman who had been protecting herself with the appearance of childhood innocence. "Tell me everything," Jacob said quietly. "From the beginning." Emma took a shaky breath and began the story she had been carrying alone for so long. After Samuel's death in the car accident, she had indeed been placed in foster care, but instead of the simple story of neglect she had initially shared, the reality was far more harrowing. "The first placement wasn't terrible," she said, her voice growing stronger as she found her courage. "The Hendersons were decent people, just overwhelmed with too many kids and not enough time. But when I started asking questions about my father's family, about whether they had tried to find relatives, Mrs. Henderson got nervous. She said I was causing trouble, making the other kids restless. Emma had been moved to a second placement, then a third. Each time, her questions about family connections were dismissed as fantasy or troublemaking. Social workers noted in her file that she was prone to making up stories about Amish relatives and resistant to adjustment in her placements. "The worst was the Caldwell house," Emma continued, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Mr. Caldwell said children needed to earn their keep, that foster kids were lucky to have a roof over their heads and shouldn't expect charity. We worked from dawn to dark, cleaning, cooking, doing laundry for his wife's business. When I complained to my caseworker, she said I was being ungrateful." Jacob felt anger rising in his chest like a tide. "What kind of work were you doing at age 9? "Everything. Scrubbing floors, washing dishes, taking care of the younger kids. Mrs. Caldwell had some kind of illness that kept her in bed most days, so the foster children did all the household work. When I got sick once, pneumonia, Mr. Caldwell said I was faking to get out of chores. He made me work anyway." The story grew worse as Emma continued. The Caldwells had been running what amounted to a child labor operation, taking in foster children to work in their commercial laundry business while collecting monthly payments from the state. When Emma finally gathered the courage to report the abuse to authorities, she was moved again, but to an even worse situation. "The Kowalski placement was different but scarier," Emma said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Mr. Kowalski he paid too much attention to the girls, inappropriate attention. When I told my caseworker, she said I was a troubled child with a history of making false accusations." Jacob's hand shook as he absorbed this information. His brother's child, his granddaughter, had endured years of abuse and neglect while he lived peacefully on his farm, unaware of her existence or her suffering. "I started planning my escape 2 years ago," Emma continued. "I saved every piece of information I could find about Lancaster County, about Amish communities, about you. My father had told me so many stories that I felt like I knew this place before I ever saw it." She had spent months researching bus routes, calculating distances, saving small amounts of money from odd jobs she could manage while supposedly attending school. Her plan had been methodical and patient, waiting for the right moment when supervision would be relaxed enough for her to slip away. The night I left, Mr. Kowalski tried to... Emma paused, struggling with words for something no child should have to describe. I knew if I stayed another day, something terrible was going to happen. So I took the money I had saved, left a note saying I was going to find my real family, and walked to the bus station. The journey from Philadelphia to Lancaster County had taken her 3 days, riding buses and walking when she ran out of money, sleeping in bus stations and public restrooms, eating whatever she could afford from vending machines. She had arrived at Jacob's farm exhausted, hungry and terrified, but driven by her father's stories about the grandfather who would understand about family being more important than rules. I'm sorry I lied about my age, Emma said, tears flowing. Really now. I was afraid that if you knew I was 14, you might think I was old enough to take care of myself. I was afraid you would send me back. Jacob stood slowly and moved to Emma's side of the table. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms and held her while she sobbed against his chest. Not the careful, controlled tears of a mature 10-year-old, but the desperate crying of a teenager who had been carrying unbearable burdens for far too long. You're safe now, he murmured into her hair. You're home now. No one will ever hurt you again. As Emma's sobs gradually subsided, Jacob felt the full weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This changed everything about their legal situation. A 14-year-old runaway who had crossed state lines was a much more serious matter than a lost 10-year-old. The authorities would be looking harder, investigating more thoroughly, taking the case more seriously. But it also changed everything about Emma herself. Jacob realized he had been seeing her through the lens of her apparent age, treating her as a gifted child, rather than recognizing her as a traumatized teenager who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. Her maturity, her competence, her ability to navigate complex situations, all of it made sense now. Emma, he said gently, we need to call Elizabeth Hartman immediately. This information changes our legal strategy completely. Emma pulled back from his embrace, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Will it make things harder? It makes things different, Jacob replied honestly. But it also makes you old enough to testify on your own behalf about what you've experienced, old enough to tell a judge exactly why you chose to find your grandfather instead of staying in foster care. That afternoon, as Jacob and Emma sat with Elizabeth Hartman in her office, the lawyer's expression grew increasingly grim as she learned the full scope of Emma's experiences. This is criminal neglect by the foster care system, Elizabeth said, finally. Emma, you've been failed by every adult who was supposed to protect you. We're going to make sure that stops now. She explained that Emma's age actually strengthened their case in some ways. At 14, Emma was old enough for her preferences to carry significant weight in custody decisions. Her ability to articulate her experiences and her clear desire to remain with Jacob would be powerful testimony. But we're also dealing with a much more serious situation regarding the foster care system's failures, Elizabeth warned. They're going to fight harder to avoid admitting their mistakes. We need to be prepared for a battle. As they drove home, through the golden Lancaster County countryside, Emma seemed somehow lighter, despite the emotional difficulty of sharing her story. The burden of secrets had been lifted from her shoulders, replaced by the strength that comes from being fully known and completely accepted. Grandpa Jacob, she said as they turned into the farm's driveway, do you think my father would be proud of how I found my way home? Jacob looked at this remarkable young woman, for he understood now that she was no longer a child if she ever truly had been, and felt his heart swell with admiration for her courage and determination. I think Samuel would be amazed by your strength, he said. I think he would be grateful that his stories about home were strong enough to guide you through the darkness and bring you safely to family. That night, As Emma settled into bed with one of Samuel's carved horses on her nightstand and Sarah's quilt pulled up to her chin, Jacob understood that his quiet life had been transformed by something far more complex and precious than he had initially realized. Emma wasn't just a lost child who needed shelter. She was a survivor who had chosen love over safety, family over security, hope over despair. And tomorrow they would begin the fight to make sure she never had to make such a choice again. Legal documents arrived on a crisp October morning, delivered by certified mail, in an envelope bearing the imposing seal of the Pennsylvania Department of Children and Family Services. Elizabeth Hartman had warned Jacob to expect them, but seeing the official papers still sent a chill through his chest. The state was formally challenging his guardianship of Emma, citing his age, unmarried status, and what they termed irregular circumstances surrounding the minor's placement. But tucked inside the same envelope was a document that changed everything. Samuel's original will, properly filed with the Allegheny County Probate Court, naming Jacob as Emma's legal guardian in the event of Samuel's death. More importantly, Elizabeth had discovered that the will had been filed with the proper authorities 5 years ago, when Samuel died. The foster care system had simply never bothered to search for it. "This is our smoking gun," Elizabeth explained, as she spread the documents across Jacob's kitchen table. "Not only do we have Samuel's clear intent, but we also have documented proof that the state violated their own procedures by failing to conduct a proper family search before placing Emma in foster care." Emma sat quietly beside Jacob, studying the legal papers with the serious attention she gave to everything important. At 14, she understood the gravity of the situation better than Jacob had initially realized. Her childhood had been stolen by circumstances and abuse, but her intelligence and determination had survived intact. "What does this mean for the hearing?" Jacob asked. "It means we're not just fighting for custody," Elizabeth replied. "We're exposing systematic failures that put Emma at risk for 5 years. The state is going to be on the defensive, trying to minimize their liability rather than focusing on your suitability as a guardian." The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks away, giving them time to prepare their case, but also time for worry to build. Jacob threw himself into the preparations with the same methodical attention he gave to his farming. Character references poured in from the Amish community, letters from Bishop Miller, testimonials from neighbors who had watched Jacob and Emma together, statements from local merchants who had observed their interactions. David Byler helped coordinate the community response, organizing a level of cooperation with English authorities that was unprecedented in their district. Traditionally, the Amish avoided involvement with government institutions whenever possible, preferring to handle their problems privately within the community. But Emma's situation had touched something deep in their collective conscience. "Her child belongs with family," Bishop Miller told Jacob one evening, as they reviewed the growing pile of support letters. "Sometimes English law and God's law point in the same direction. When they do, we must not be afraid to stand up for what is right." Emma had been keeping a journal throughout their ordeal, documenting her experiences and feelings in a composition book with a marbled cover. Jacob discovered this quite by accident when he found her writing late one evening by the light of a kerosene lamp. "It helps me think through everything that's happened," she explained, not trying to hide the pages from his view. "My father always said writing was a way of making sense of complicated feelings." Jacob asked if he could read some of her entries, understanding that her own words might be powerful testimony about her experiences and her desires for the future. Emma agreed, trusting him with thoughts she had shared with no one else. Her writing revealed a young woman of remarkable resilience and insight. She wrote about her memories of Samuel, her terror during the worst foster placements, her desperate journey to Lancaster County, and her growing sense of belonging on Jacob's farm. But most powerfully, she wrote about forgiveness, her ability to forgive the adults who had failed her, her understanding of why Jacob had initially turned away from Samuel, and her hope that love could overcome the damage caused by years of separation and pain. October 10th, Jacob read aloud from one entry. Grandpa Jacob asked me today if I was angry about all the years we lost, all the time I spent in foster care when I could have been here instead. The truth is, I'm sad about those years, but not angry. Anger would just be another kind of prison, and I've already spent too much time locked up in places I didn't choose. Being here, being loved, being part of a family, that's worth waiting. For even if the waiting was harder than it should have been, Elizabeth was particularly interested in Emma's detailed accounts of her foster care experiences. While painful to read, they provided crucial evidence about why Emma had felt compelled to run away and why returning her to the system would be harmful to her well-being. Emma's testimony is going to be the heart of our case, Elizabeth explained. At 14, her voice carries significant weight in custody decisions. Her ability to articulate her experiences and her clear preference to remain with you will be difficult for the court to ignore. But the state was not giving up without a fight. Elizabeth learned through legal channels that they were bringing in expert witnesses to testify about the challenges of placing teenagers in non-traditional family structures. They would argue that Emma needed the services and support that only a licensed foster care facility could provide. They're also going to question whether an elderly Amish man can properly prepare a teenage girl for life in modern society, Elizabeth warned. Education, healthcare, social development, they'll argue that Emma's long-term interests require placement in a setting that can address these needs. Jacob felt the weight of these arguments. At 68, he was indeed elderly by most standards. His 8th grade education might seem inadequate for guiding a bright teenager through high school and college preparation. His isolated farm life might appear limiting to those who valued exposure to diverse experiences and opportunities. But as he watched Emma working in Sarah's garden, preserving vegetables for the winter, with skills that would serve her throughout her life, Jacob knew that education came in many forms. Emma was learning responsibility, self-reliance, the satisfaction of meaningful work, and the security that comes from being genuinely loved and valued. The community rallied around them with increasing intensity as the hearing date approached. Rebecca Yoder organized the women to prepare testimony about Emma's integration into their social fabric. Samuel Yoder and the other men documented Emma's contributions to farm work and her understanding of traditional skills. The local school teacher, despite teaching in a one-room schoolhouse, prepared detailed reports about Emma's academic progress and her ability to learn at an accelerated pace. Most surprisingly, Dr. Sarah Chen, the English doctor who served the Amish community when modern medical care was needed, volunteered to testify about Emma's physical and emotional health. She had examined Emma at Jacob's request and found a teenager who was thriving despite her traumatic background. Emma shows remarkable resilience, Dr. Chen wrote in her report. Her physical health is excellent. Her emotional development is appropriate for her age, and her attachment to her grandfather is clearly beneficial to her well-being. I have seen many children from troubled backgrounds, and Emma's recovery in Mr. Stoltzfus's care is nothing short of remarkable. As the hearing date grew closer, Jacob found himself walking his fields late at night, wrestling with doubts and fears that he couldn't share with Emma. What if the court decided he was too old, too set in his ways, too removed from modern life to provide what a teenage girl needed? What if their beautiful weeks together had been nothing more than a temporary respite, before Emma was forced back into the system that had already failed her so badly? 3 days before the hearing, Emma found him standing in the wheat field, where they had first met, looking up at stars that seemed sharper and brighter in the crisp autumn air. "You're worried about the hearing," she said, not asking but stating a fact. Jacob nodded. not trusting his voice. "Grandpa Jacob," Emma said gently, "whatever happens in that courtroom, you've already saved me. You've given me a family, a home, the knowledge that I'm loved and wanted. Even if they take me away, which they won't, nobody can take away what you've given me." Jacob looked down at this extraordinary young woman, his brother's daughter, his own granddaughter in every way that mattered, and felt his fears transform into determination. Tomorrow they would walk into a courthouse and fight for their right to be a family. They would face down bureaucrats and experts and people who thought they knew better what Emma needed than Emma herself knew. "We're going to win," Jacob said. And for the first time since receiving the legal papers, he truly believed it. The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect autumn weather that made the world seem crisp with possibility. Jacob and Emma dressed in their finest clothes. He in his best black suit, and she in a navy dress that Rebecca Yoder had sewn specifically for the hearing. As they climbed into David Byler's car for the drive to the courthouse, Jacob carried a leather portfolio containing all their documentation, and Emma carried her journal, ready to tell her story with courage and clarity. Behind them, in cars and buggies, came members of their community who had taken time away from their own work to support them. It was an unprecedented show of solidarity, a statement that family and love mattered more than rules and regulations. The battle for Emma's future was about to begin, and Jacob had never been more ready to fight. The Lancaster County Courthouse was an imposing building of red brick and white columns, designed to inspire respect for the law and perhaps a healthy dose of intimidation for those who found themselves within its walls. Jacob had never set foot inside a courtroom in his 68 years, and the formal atmosphere, the polished wood, the American flag, the elevated judge's bench felt as foreign to him as a different planet. Emma sat beside him at the plaintiff's table, her small hands folded in her lap, her journal tucked carefully in the bag at her feet. Despite her 14 years and all she had endured, she looked particularly young in the formal setting, which Jacob hoped would work in their favor. The judge needed to see not a runaway teenager who had manipulated the system, but a child who had been failed by every adult charged with protecting her. Judge Patricia Thornton was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the crowded courtroom. She had a reputation for fairness, but also for asking hard questions and expecting honest answers. Elizabeth Hartman had warned them that Judge Thornton was particularly concerned about cases involving children, having seen too many young lives damaged by well-meaning but inadequate decisions. The courtroom was fuller than Jacob had expected. The left side was occupied by members of the Amish community who had come to support them. Bishop Miller, the Yoders, David Byler, and nearly 24 others who had never set foot in a courthouse, but felt compelled to witness this unprecedented case. Their plain clothing and serious expressions created a striking visual contrast to the formal legal setting. On the right side sat representatives from the Department of Children and Family Services. Their lawyer and two expert witnesses, Elizabeth, had warned them about Dr. Michael Robbins, a child psychologist who specialized in foster care placements, and Mrs. Carol Stevens, a social worker with 30 years of experience in family services. Elizabeth began their case by methodically documenting the foster care system's failures. She presented Samuel's will, properly filed 5 years earlier, proving that the authorities had never conducted the required family search before placing Emma in care. "Your Honor," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "Emma Stoltzfus spent 5 years in a system that failed her from the very beginning. Her father had named her grandfather as her guardian, had filed the proper legal documents, had provided clear direction about his daughter's care in the event of his death. Yet somehow, these documents were never discovered, never acted upon, never even searched for. The state's attorney, a thin man named Robert Chen, argued that the foster care system had followed standard procedures and that any oversights were regrettable, but not grounds for placing a teenager in what he termed An unsuitable environment? Mr. Stoltzfus is a 68-year-old unmarried man with no experience raising children, particularly teenage girls, Chen argued. While his intentions may be admirable, Emma's needs require more than good intentions. She needs professional support, educational opportunities, and preparation for life in modern society. Judge Thornton listened to both opening arguments with careful attention, making notes and occasionally asking for clarification. When the presentations concluded, she called for the first witness, Dr. Sarah Chen, the physician who served the Amish community, took the stand with calm confidence. Her testimony about Emma's physical and emotional health was devastating to the state's case. In my 20 years of practice, I have never seen a child recover from trauma as completely as Emma has in Mr. Stoltzfus's care, Dr. Chen testified. When she first came to see me 6 weeks ago, I observed a teenager who was thriving, physically healthy, emotionally stable, and clearly bonded with her grandfather. The transformation from her documented condition in foster care is remarkable. Robert. Chen attempted to challenge Dr. Chen's qualifications and suggest that the Amish lifestyle might limit Emma's development. But Judge Thornton quickly shut down that line of questioning. Are you suggesting, Mr. Chen, that living in a stable, loving home with family is somehow inferior to remaining in foster care? The judge asked pointedly. The next witness was Bishop Miller, who spoke with quiet dignity about Emma's integration into their community and the support system that surrounded her. We believe that children belong with family when possible, Bishop Miller testified. Emma is not just Jacob's granddaughter, she is part of our community, welcomed and supported by all of us. She has found not just a home, but a place where she belongs. When Emma was called to testify, the courtroom fell completely silent. She walked to the witness stand with her head held high, her hand steady as she swore to tell the truth. Jacob felt his heart pounding as she faced the judge, knowing that her testimony would likely determine their future. Emma, Elizabeth began gently, can you tell the court about your life before you came to live with your grandfather? Emma's voice was clear and strong as she began to describe her experiences in foster care. She spoke without self-pity, but with devastating honesty about the neglect, the abuse, the sense of being unwanted and disposable that had marked her years in the system. I wasn't a child to them, Emma testified. I was a case number, a monthly payment, a problem to be managed. When I tried to tell social workers about what was happening, they said I was a troublemaker who made up stories. Judge Thornton leaned forward, clearly affected by Emma's composure and the horrible experiences she was describing. Emma, the judge said gently, how do you feel about living with your grandfather? Emma looked directly at Jacob, her green eyes, bright with unshed tears. Your Honor, for the first time in 5 years, I feel like I'm home. I feel safe. I feel loved. I feel like I matter to someone. Emma's testimony continued for nearly an hour, her voice never wavering as she described the systematic failures that had marked her 5 years in foster care. Judge Thornton asked pointed questions about specific incidents, and Emma answered, with a clarity that belied her 14 years. When she described her careful planning and dangerous journey to find Jacob, her courage impressed even the skeptical court officials. Emma, Elizabeth said, as the testimony neared its end, why didn't you report your location to authorities when you reached Lancaster County? Why did you choose to hide rather than work with the social services system? Emma considered the question carefully before answering. Because the system had already proven it didn't protect me. Every time I asked for help, I was punished for asking. Every time I reported abuse, I was told I was lying or causing trouble. I couldn't risk being sent back to people who would hurt me. Robert Chen's cross-examination was aggressive but ultimately ineffective. When he suggested that Emma had been manipulative in deceiving Jacob about her age, Emma's response was devastating in its simplicity. I was trying to survive, she said quietly. I learned to be whatever people needed me to be, because that was the only way to stay safe. But with my grandfather, I didn't have to pretend. He loved me for who I really was. When Emma stepped down from the witness stand, Jacob saw something he had never witnessed before. Several members of the court staff were wiping their eyes. Even Judge Thornton appeared visibly moved by the teenager's composure and honesty. The state called Dr. Michael Robbins, the child psychologist, who argued that Emma's attachment to Jacob might be unhealthy, born of desperation rather than genuine family bonds. His testimony was clinical and detached, focused on statistics about placement success rates and the challenges of teenagers living with elderly guardians. Mr. Stoltzfus lacks the resources and experience necessary to guide a traumatized teenager through the complex process of healing and development, Dr. Robbins testified. Emma would benefit from professional counseling, structured educational opportunities, and exposure to peers her own age. Elizabeth's cross-examination of Dr. Robbins was methodical and devastating. She established that he had never met Emma, never observed her in Jacob's home, never spoken with any of the community members who had witnessed their relationship. "Doctor," Elizabeth asked, "you've testified about what Emma needs based on your general expertise. But have you considered what Emma wants? Have you given any weight to her clearly expressed preference to remain with her grandfather?" "Children often don't know what's best for them," Dr. Robbins replied. "That's why we have professional systems to make these decisions." "And how well has that professional system served Emma over the past 5 years?" Elizabeth asked pointedly. Judge Thornton called a brief recess, during which Jacob and Emma sat quietly while community members offered gentle words of support. When court reconvened, Elizabeth called her final witness, Jacob himself. Jacob walked to the witness stand with the same steady dignity he brought to all of life's challenges. His plain black suit and weathered hands marked him as different from the lawyers and officials who had testified earlier. But his quiet strength commanded respect. Elizabeth led him through his background, his marriage to Sarah, his long isolation. After her death and his initial reaction to Emma's arrival, Jacob spoke honestly about his doubts and fears, his lack of experience with children, and his growing understanding of what Emma needed from him. "Mr. Stoltzfus," Elizabeth said, "the state has argued that you're too old, too isolated, too set in your ways to properly care for a teenage girl. How do you respond to these concerns?" Jacob looked directly at Judge Thornton. "Your Honor, I may be 68, but I'm healthy and capable. I may live simply, but Emma has everything she needs: food, shelter, medical care, education, and, most importantly, love. I may not know much about raising teenagers, but I'm learning every day, and I have a whole community helping me." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I failed my brother Samuel by letting rules matter more than love. I won't make that mistake with Emma. She's not just my responsibility, she's my joy, my second chance to do right by family." Robert Chen's cross-examination focused on practical concerns about Emma's future, her education, her career prospects, her preparation for life beyond the farm. Jacob acknowledged these challenges but remained firm in his commitment. "I may not be able to prepare Emma for every possibility," Jacob said, "but I can give her something more valuable than any system can provide: the knowledge that she's loved unconditionally, that she belongs somewhere, that she has family who will never abandon her." When the testimony concluded, Judge Thornton announced that she needed time to consider all the evidence before making her decision. "This case involves complex issues about family rights, state responsibilities, and a child's best interests," she said. "I will render my decision tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. As they left the courthouse, Jacob felt emotionally drained but oddly peaceful. They had presented their case honestly and completely. Emma had shown remarkable courage in sharing her story. The community had demonstrated their support in an unprecedented way. Whatever Judge Thornton decided, Jacob knew they had fought with integrity for something that mattered more than life itself: the right to be a family. That evening, as Emma worked beside him on a new wooden sign for their farm gate, Jacob marveled at her resilience. Tomorrow would bring either celebration or heartbreak, but tonight they were together, working side by side, creating something beautiful with their own hands. The sign read simply, "Stoltzfus Family Farm." Whatever happened in court, that truth would endure. 6 months after Judge Thornton's decision granting Jacob permanent custody of Emma, the morning routine at the Stoltzfus farm had settled into the comfortable rhythm of genuine family life. Emma rose before dawn to help with the milking, her movements now as natural and practiced as Jacob's own. The once quiet farmhouse hummed with conversation, laughter, and the pleasant bustle of two people who had found their way home to each other. Emma maintained her journal faithfully, documenting not just the major events of their shared life, but the small, precious moments that made up the texture of belonging. Her entries had evolved from the desperate hope and careful observations of a child trying to survive to the thoughtful reflections of a young woman discovering who she was meant to become. March 15th, she wrote one morning after helping Jacob repair a section of fence damaged by winter storms. Grandpa Jacob says, "I have Dad's hands for working with tools, but Mum's patience for detailed work. I never thought I could miss people I barely knew, but having their qualities pointed out in me makes them feel present somehow. It's like they live on in the way I hold a hammer or thread a needle." The legal victory had been decisive, but not immediate. Judge Thornton had taken 2 days to review all the evidence before calling them back to court. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of careful consideration and genuine emotion. In 30 years on the bench, Judge Thornton had said, "I have seen many cases involving children caught between systems and families, between rules and love, between what's easy and what's right. Rarely have I seen such clear evidence that a child belongs exactly where she chooses to be." The judge had not only granted Jacob permanent custody, but had also ordered an investigation into the foster care system's handling of Emma's case. 3. Social workers had been disciplined, new procedures had been implemented for family searches, and Emma's case had become a catalyst for broader reforms in how the system handled children with potential family connections. But for Jacob and Emma, the most important outcome was simply being able to continue the life they had built together. Emma excelled in her studies at the local one-room schoolhouse, her intelligence and maturity making her a natural leader among students of all ages. She had also begun helping other families in the community, her experiences making her uniquely qualified to understand children who were struggling with loss or displacement. The farm itself had transformed under Emma's influence. Sarah's garden, dormant for 20 years, now bloomed with vegetables, herbs, and flowers that Emma tended with the same careful attention Sarah had once given. The house, preserved like a museum since Sarah's death, had come alive again with Emma's presence, her books on the shelves, her sketches on the walls, her laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent too long. Emma's artistic talents, inherited from Samuel, had found new expression in traditional Amish crafts. She had completed the family quilt that Sarah had started decades ago, adding her own panels that told the story of finding home after years of wandering. The quilt now covered Jacob's bed, a tangible reminder of how love could span generations and overcome any obstacle. On this particular morning, as spring returned to Lancaster County, Jacob found Emma in the barn workshop he had set up for her, carefully sanding the rocking horse Samuel had begun carving years ago. She had been working on it steadily through the winter, using techniques Samuel had taught her and others she had learned from Jacob and community craftsmen. "It's almost finished," she said, looking up from her work with satisfaction. "I want to give it to the Yoda's new baby when it arrives next month." Jacob examined her work with the critical eye of someone who understood quality craftsmanship. Emma had not only completed Samuel's design, but had improved upon it, adding subtle details that showed her growing mastery of woodworking. The horse's mane flowed like water. Its legs were positioned in perfect galloping motion, and its eyes seemed alive with spirit, exactly like the small horse Samuel had carved for Jacob decades ago. "Your father would be proud," Jacob said, running his fingers over the smooth curves Emma had created. "You've taken his vision and made it your own." Emma set down her sandpaper and looked at Jacob with the serious expression that still reminded him so much of Samuel. "Do you think he can see us? Do you think he knows we found each other?" Jacob considered the question carefully, understanding its importance to Emma's sense of peace about the past. "I think love doesn't end with death," he said finally. "I think Samuel's love for you and for me created something strong enough to guide you home when you needed it most. Whether he can see us or not, his love is still working in the world through what we've built together." That afternoon brought a letter from Elizabeth Hartman with news that the last of the legal complications from Emma's case had been resolved. The foster care system had agreed to a significant financial settlement that would be held in trust for Emma's education and future needs. More importantly, they had officially acknowledged their failures and implemented the reforms Judge Thornton had mandated. "It's over," Emma said, reading the lawyer's letter over Jacob's shoulder. "Really, truly over." Jacob felt the last weight of worry lift from his shoulders. For months, he had carried the fear that some legal technicality or bureaucratic challenge might still threaten their family. Now, finally, they were free to simply live as grandfather and granddaughter without looking over their shoulders. That evening, as they worked together in Sarah's garden planting seeds for the coming growing season, Jacob reflected on how completely his life had changed. The wheat field where he had first encountered Emma still stretched golden in the evening light, but it was no longer the boundary of his world. It was the heart of a family farm where love had triumphed over loss, where broken connections had been restored, where the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. Emma knelt beside him, carefully placing tomato seeds in the rich earth with the same patient attention she brought to all of life's important tasks. In her profile, Jacob could see traces of Samuel, of Sarah, of all the family members who had shaped the person she was becoming. "Grandpa Jacob," Emma said, not looking up from her planting, "thank you for saying yes that first day. Thank you for seeing past the questions to what really mattered." Jacob reached over and squeezed her dirt-stained hand, marveling again at how perfectly it fit within his own weathered palm. "Thank you for being brave enough to find your way home, granddaughter. Thank you for bringing our family back together." As the sun set over Lancaster County, casting long shadows across fields that had witnessed generations of Stoltzfus hopes and dreams, Jacob understood that some stories don't end, they simply transform into new beginnings. Emma's arrival had not just saved a lost child, it had restored a broken family, healed old wounds, and proven that love, patience, and faith could overcome any obstacle. In her journal that night, Emma wrote, "Today I planted seeds that will grow into food for our table next fall. But the most important seeds were planted months ago, seeds of trust, love, and belonging that have already grown into the most beautiful harvest of all, home."